sure that sort of at first glance law and literature is an especially vertiginous leap off the edge, or spin off the edge. The edge is so well trodden as to become a sort of field in its own right. But I guess if you want the sort of vertiginous effect, I hope it's going to emerge from the way in which we interrogate or think through the text of Jekyll and Hyde. And we have a really, I guess, the four perfect people, I think, to talk us through or develop a conversation about Jekyll and Hyde, which may be in some sense focused on Law's own bipolarity. In his quasi-autobiographical text, Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, recounts his experience of in Paris, thinking he should go and try his hand at law simply to sort of dabble and see what this law thing was all about. And he emerged extremely disappointed. He said, basically, law turned out to be this improbable mix or combination of theology and the tabloid press. So on the one hand, you had the exegesis of venerable authorities and righteous instrumentality. And on the other hand, you had the enjoyment of the base material of society, or the rabble. So I guess, hopefully, we're going to be exploring some of that bipolarity. So let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak, beginning with my colleague, Lacey, from the Law Department here at the LSE, who is, if I may say so, simply the most innovative and distinctive and influential thinker in terms of political theory and social theory and economy and history. You get a sense of the breadth of the agenda of criminal law. She has for some time been focusing on questions of women and crime and construction of criminality, most recently in the form of the exploration of literature, certain literary texts, as a kind of medium or mirror for the evolution of legal notions of responsibility, and these are represented in her most recent work, Women, Crime and Character, which tells of a shift from Noel Flanders to Tessa Turbeville. Next, Robert Mighall, who is or was the editor of the Penguin Classic edition of Jekyll and Hyde, and the author of an extremely thought-provoking work on Gothic fiction called A Geography of Victorian Gothic Fiction, Mapping History's Nightmare. I'm going at this point to quote from one of Robert's fans on the Amazon website describing his work on Gothic fiction. It's from a fan in New Orleans, and it says the following, I mean, that guy is darker than the bottom of a bayou. A very dark, particularly spooky bayou. Probably haunted. And yet, Robert is probably best known and most recently known for his book Sunshine, which is a cultural a cultural history of heliophilia, the story of a personal joyous addiction to the sun. In Sunshine, at a certain point, Robert is very careful to say that he's a purist about the sun. He has never, except in the spirit of experiment, ventured into a salon or used a sunbed. So I take it that we can safely say that Robert has actually not been tinctured by the very darkness he was trying to describe earlier. His most recent book is a biography of Keats, which may or may not be on the table outside. Our next speaker will be Mary Evans, currently visiting professor at the Gender Institute here at the LSE. She's the author of a number of social, theoretical, historical works on literature, including, I should say, even though it's not the same genre we're talking about, a really remarkable work on Jane Austen and the State, which I think of and read as a very timely kind of remedy to the sort of period costume drama approach to Jane Austen that one sees on television and film. She has more recently been exploring relations between crime, writing, and the social and cultural fabrication of evil. And her latest work is on what one might call a kind of literary sociology of detective fiction, which is entitled The Pursuit of Evil, Detective Fiction and the Modern World. Our last speaker will be Juliet Mitchell, who has recently started as the director of a doctoral program in theoretical psychoanalysis at UCL. Juliet is one of the pioneering and most influential voices in psychoanalysis and feminism, the editor and commentator on Sigmund Freud, Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, collaborator with Julia Kristeva, Jacqueline Rose, and all of the luminaries of the feminist and psychoanalytical writing movement. She is also, and this is a connection to our first speaker, Nikki, she has also wrote the introduction to Mighall, the Penguin Classics edition, and she's written widely on various works of literature and authors, Henry James, Tolstoy, Shakespeare, and so on. So I hope you'll agree with me that we have the perfect speakers for this event. What they will be doing, what we will be doing, is basically each of our speakers will throw out a few prompts for thought in the form of questions or observations, and then we will take discussion from there, and at a certain point invite you to throw in your own observations and questions. So, Vicky.
Thank you, Alain, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to I'm really going to just explain to you how, as a lawyer, I came to Jekyll and Hyde and why I'm particularly interested in it, and then we'll follow that up with the themes that the more expert people on this panel will be putting in. But I think it's appropriate to start just with an acknowledgement of what an extraordinarily beautiful piece of writing Jekyll and Hyde is. I always feel that as an academic who's come to use literature as a resource in various ways, there is a sense in which I'm sort of plundering something which has an integrity of its own. And particularly given this is Stevenson as poet as well as marvellous prose writer and plot crafter. It's a book in which every word drops its own weight. And Roberts, I think, very justly remarks in his introduction to the Penguin edition that it's a book in which you find something new every time you read it. It really, although it's the story that has its hold on the popular imagination, the actual crafting of the story in Stevenson's prose is really a very extraordinary thing. Now, I nonetheless became interested in Jekyll and Hyde for quite instrumental academic purposes, and Alain has really given you the beginning of the story, and that is that I've been interested for some time in what is often seen as a sort of significant change between the late 17th century and the late 19th century, between a conception of criminality and of criminal responsibility as founded in evil or bad character, towards a much more psychological notion of criminal responsibility, in which the question of the offender's responsibility for what they've done comes to be constructed in far more psychological terms, and particularly in terms of the idea of somebody being both conscious of what they're doing and having normal faculties of self-control. So we don't hold people responsible, we pretend not to hold people responsible unless they have those powers of understanding and control. And I have begun to have my doubts about the sort of neatness of this teleology, of this idea that you see a sort of gradual displacement of older ideas of criminality as founded in bad character towards this more, as it were, scientific notion of criminality or criminal responsibility as founded in the proof of certain psychological capacities as being engaged. And so I decided to do a sort of fairly in-depth study of the mental incapacity defences in criminal law in the late 19th century, because I thought if there, at a time when the psychological model was meant to have pretty much triumphed, and in an area where if it had triumphed anywhere, well, surely you would find it pretty completely reflected in the area of insanity and mental incapacity, then if I still nonetheless found traces of the idea of criminality as based in bad character there, then that really was quite a significant finding. So those of you who've read Jekyll and Hyde recently will immediately understand why I became very interested in Jekyll and Hyde, because I think the very fascinating thing that the story does is that it holds together three what we might call completely different cosmologies. On the one hand, and these are probably the things that are most famous about Jekyll and Hyde, Mr. Hyde is atavistic, he's a troglodyte, he's a throwback. Coming out of emerging evolutionary theory, there's the idea that criminality is a sort of throwback to a degenerate or a primitive past. That theme is very strong in Jekyll and Hyde. Second theme, Hyde is the product of Jekyll's insanity, the sort of quasi-medical theme, the scientific theme, if you like, the medical scientific theme. But there's a third theme, and it's the one that I was most interested in, really, and that is the theme of Hyde as evil. At various points, Stevenson uses very explicit biblical language. Hyde is the slime of the pit appearing on earth. Very, very vivid language. And these three completely different ways of understanding criminality or criminal behaviour are held together beautifully within the story. They don't appear to be fighting with each other, really. And I think that interested me because, of course, in academic work, we tend to look for and indeed impose very neat structures on social reality. It's a really pleasing idea that character responsibility is gradually displaced by capacity responsibility. But of course the world is very much more complex than that. And that complexity is reflected in the Victorian idea of moral insanity, which was a sort of glue that held different understandings of crime together. In the literary world, these understandings lived together perfectly happily. Briefly, there were two other specific things that came out of Jekyll and Hyde for me. The first I was aware of before I read the book, and it was actually one of the things that led me to the book, and that was that by the time we get to the late 19th century in this country, we have a very well-developed system of criminal regulation. The state has become very proud of its capacity to regulate criminal behaviour, to punish effectively, and so on. What we also see in that, particularly the latter part of the 19th century, is something that is close to a social obsession with states of double consciousness, with things like mesmerism, hypnotism, sleepwalking, these sorts of phenomena, described by one of the best historians of this period as being a bit like, the Victorians were a bit like people with a fear of snakes who somehow can't keep out of the reptile house at the zoo. They keep revisiting this. And why was that? Well, I think a plausible argument about it is that late Victorian project of regulation was hugely dependent on the assumption that human beings are capable psychological subjects who are unified in some sense, who know what's going on and control their behaviour. And the idea that there's this other side to the human mind, which is evoked in mesmerism, which arises voluntarily, involuntarily, in sleepwalking and so on, was deeply threatening to that project of regulation. And you see that emerging very strongly, I think, in Jekyll and Hyde, as you do in the picture of Dorian Gray. And even earlier in the century, as you do in a book like James Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which also, like Jekyll and Hyde, holds together these very different cosmologies. On the one hand, a religious, theological cosmology, and on the other, a much more psychological one. Now, Dorian Gray brings me to the third and final theme that I'm very interested in the book, and that is the question of the recognition of criminality. The question of how we recognise and identify criminal behaviour, how we distinguish between criminality and normal behaviour, has always been a troubling thing socially, but it became increasingly troubling as we moved into a more urbanised, anonymous, individualistic world, and also a world that's more pluralistic in terms of what people thought about right and wrong. And so again, the Victorian period in this country displays a lot of anxiety, but also a lot of productive political and institutional development about how we go about identifying crime. We have, for example, the whole business of the introduction of statistics, the application of evolutionary theory. Some of these images that Alain has cleverly put on the screen evoke that. And in the latter part of the century, we had special statutes identifying particular categories of criminal, the inebriate, the feeble-minded, trying to sort of create recognisable categories so we can tell who's a real criminal, as it were. But there's an anxiety about this, and Jekyll and Hyde takes us deep, deep, deep down into the bayou, the dark bayou of that anxiety, because although, on the one hand, Hyde, whenever people see Hyde, they always find him repellent. And Stevenson really emphasises this. Everybody knows that Hyde is a bad lot. But on the other hand, if Hyde is Jekyll, then criminality is entirely unrecognisable, and that, I think, is the deepest fear, in a way, that is reflected in the horror of this story. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, something you said maybe. I'm just finishing my note, if I may.
Actually, okay, while Robert finishes his note, let me just also say that one of the interesting things about the double personality, double consciousness aspect of Jekyll and Hyde, which is in a way its most obvious structural quality, is that it also leads into a more radical theme, which actually Robert pointed out to all of us in the email exchange that we had before meeting today, of actual dual legal identity, in the sense that, unlike the Dorian Gray thing, where it's just a human being and a changing image, Jekyll and Hyde are two different people, to the extent that Jekyll intends to leave his property to Hyde. And so we're very lucky that Alain, as well as chairing, is actually a very sophisticated kind of property lawyer, and we'll probably call on him.
Sorry, no, it's just something you said about the visibility of evil and Dorian Gray as well, because I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting in both texts actually is the way that they try to rely upon this idea that evil writes itself across the face, to quote Utterson. So there is that framework in place, and they're trying to kind of have that operate and that be an index to truth. But it doesn't, for this very reason, because the understanding, the revelation at the end is that this evil thing is inside Jekyll, who is the sort of the class antithesis, but also the physical antithesis of Hyde. So they're constantly stressing the difference between them. So that there is this kind of idea that this should work, but it doesn't work. logic fails for this reason. And in Dorian Gray as well, there's this kind of alibi. They both have these alibis where this logic still exists. The logic is still there, that evil is does leave a physical trace in the portrait of Dorian Gray, or the kind of the stamp, it's called, on Hyde, the reason he's so ugly. It's so different, the absolute opposite of Jekyll. So it's interesting to think, well, this still is in place and they're exploring it. And I think that's an example of what the text does. It sets up this framework of expectations that it explores and probes and gets almost to the very, very end within this framework. Utterson's the main investigator. He's acting like a detective in it, and he's trying to get to the bottom of it. And everything that should work according to his rational paradigm, everything that should lead to the revelation, cannot. There's a very interesting point where they look at the handwriting, and he gives it to his clerk, who happens to be an expert on handwriting. And he says, well, they look at Hyde's handwriting, and he said, well, it's just that the Jekyll's in reverse. So Utterson thinks, would he forge for him? So he's just kind of, his mind is set within this understanding, this framework. And of course, within law, handwriting is a very, very important way of identifying identity itself. So really, at this point, there should be this revelation, but of course there can't be, because the reason everything doesn't make sense is brilliantly revealed at the end. Not until the very last paragraph of Dr. Lanyon's narrative, which is the penultimate one in the text, do we know that two people are really one. And that's the most extraordinary narrative tour de force that he manages to pull. But also, I think, what we forget, because we know so much about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I was astonished when I was working on it, how many people haven't actually read it. Everyone knows what it's about. They say, I'm working on Jekyll and Hyde, and they sort of make a joke about it. Nothing to do with sunshine, having this kind of split personality, God knows it. I said, well, have you read it? They said, no. And I was discussing it last night, and everyone I spoke to knew what it was all about, but they hadn't read it. We have this understanding of Jekyll and Hyde. It's an idea. It's an idea that exists. It's trumped out every single time that some serial killer didn't spend all his time bumping people off. They say, a real Jekyll and Hyde is occasionally patted a puppy or something like that. And so people have got this idea, and it's this idea that, in a sense, the idea that one person is somehow multiple and fractured, and there are different parts of them. And we see this, we bring in schizophrenia and things like that, and think that that's what Jekyll and Hyde is about. It's not about that. It's about what the hell can these two very different people have to do with each other? Why is this person, Henry Jekyll, whose whole desire is to be very, very respectable, to be respected by his peers, to hold his head up high, he said. Hyde was produced by his desire, an inordinate desire, to hold his head high. Interestingly, he wants to be tall. This thing that he produces can't hold its head high. It's much shorter, and plays made on that when they're bursting into Jekyll's cabinet, it's called, where they can hear something pacing up and down. And Utterson, rational as ever, says, can you describe it? And he goes, this was a dwarf. He said, are you sure of that? He said, do you think I don't know where my master's head is on the door frame each day? So there's this idea that, yes, he does hold his head high, and he's produced this monstrosity. And I've completely lost my thread. That's it. The idea that two people are one, all the way to the very end. And I think that is what makes it a very, very rich mystery. I think whenever we read it, we've always got to remember that, because all of the logical steps, all of the kind of breadcrumbs that lead to the end, don't lead anywhere, really. They really do not lead anywhere until you get to this revelation. And even then it doesn't wholly make sense. There are slips in the logic, and you say every word was sort of thought out. I don't think every word was. Sometimes you've got to see. I think Stevenson made a mistake here. I think because and the interesting thing is where there's this kind of tumbling around and slippage of language, where he says things like, I cannot say I. That's a deliberate one. But when Hyde is there with his potion, he's gone to Lanyon's and he's mixed up the potion, and he stands with it bubbling there, and it's Hyde taunting Lanyon. And that's very much Jekyll. That's Jekyll doing that. Because he's saying something like triumphantly, this kind of hubristic statement about, are you prepared to learn? Are you prepared to, or remain hidebound all your life? It's kind of sneering him for Lanyon for his inability to sort of expand his physical paradigm of the world, his logical paradigm, to encounter the supernatural. And he said, if you are sworn under our profession, and obviously our, unless Hyde has actually qualified for medic while he's been doing all this, doesn't apply. So there are these interesting slips, and some of them are down to, I think, just, he wrote it very, very quickly. He had the dream, he drafted out the narrative, and redrafted a few times, but it's written very, very quickly. I think this kind of slipping around the way that even with the supernatural explanation, even with this kind of master key that you get to at the end, it still doesn't unlock the whole of the narrative. You still have to go back and think, well, what's a mistake and what's an interesting aspect there. Finally, yes, my interest as a literary critic who has sort of become interested in medicine and legal cases, etc., is really to have some of the more straightforward answers about law, not so much criminal responsibility. That's the exciting part. Murderers. Were they in their right mind when they committed the crime? And that goes into the court of law, and that sensation of this. I'm really interested in this more boring, mundane. What was the legal standing of that kind of idea at the time? Because that is what they're operating in up until that last moment. It is. Two people are one. Can this be done? Can Jekyll put in his will that Hyde would be able to inherit his property on his disappearance? Would that work? Because that's within the national framework before we cross over into the other side and everything's thrown up in the air and it becomes metaphysical or preternatural. That's my interest.
Thank you. What I wanted to start by describing this morning, or reading, a couple of quotations by, in one case, Claire Harmon, who has written a biography of Robert Louis Stevenson. Because what I want to do is to go some way in what I have to say towards talking about Stevenson's life, his biography, his links to the social world of the late 19th century, and some of his connections to other people who have written about mental illness, instability, evil, at around about the same time. Now, one of the things that Claire Harmon says right at the beginning of her biography is the paternal line dominates Robert Louis Stevenson's family history. And it's something of a throwaway line, which some of us might think needs a bit more unpicking. We don't throw out remarks like, the paternal line dominates this history quite so casually these days. At least some of us might think there's something more to think about there. And what I wanted to connect that with was the second quotation, which is actually from something that Virginia Woolf wrote towards the end of her life when she was trying to write her own autobiography. And when she was looking back on her childhood and adolescence, one of the things that she was trying to understand were what she described as the violent rages of her father, Leslie Stephen. And she said there was something blind, animal, savage in them. Roger Fry said that civilization meant awareness, but he was uncivilized in his extreme unawareness. And I think what Woolf is doing in that quotation, reflecting on that experience of somebody who actually in her own life seems to turn in real life into this exactly the same character of Jekyll and Hyde. On the one side, a scholarly, kind father, and on the other hand, a man capable of what she's described as these animal rages. So I think that kind of discussion of how human beings can change, how human beings in reality can be both extremely kind, quiet, and on the other hand, extremely violent, extremely furious, is something which has infused the 100 years or so since Stevenson wrote Jekyll and Hyde. What I wanted to do with that then is make 3 points about it, I suppose, and go in 3 different directions. The first is that it does seem to me that it has seemed to me since Jekyll and Hyde was written, and has, as both Nikki and Robert have said, has been very much absorbed into our culture, that this notion of Jekyll and Hyde has been hugely useful for many institutions, and that remains the case today, that the notion of good, evil, that kind of binary, fits very perfectly with certain kinds of political or social judgments. But at the same time, what it ignores is something which Stevenson wrote about very vividly, I think, in Jekyll and Hyde, and that is the pain of transformation from quiet, civilized normality into rage, savage anger, and inability to control oneself. He writes about that transformation in his novel as a transformation of pain, of agony, of something which is unendurable for the person going through that experience. So the slime of the pit isn't a comfortable place to get to. It's something which is painful to get to, and is painful obviously for other people as well, but is painful for everybody when the individual is there. And that takes me on, I think, to say something secondly about these comfortable binaries of the modern. The detective, of course, in Jekyll and Hyde has the first name of Gable, which I think is very far from accidental. You don't have a name like, it could have been John, it could have been Peter, it could have been David, but in point of fact he's Gable. So he's standing for the person who is given the responsibility of being the good person who discovers, who unmasks evil. And those binaries have, I think, persisted in institutional, political, and certainly in many kinds of the ways in which we describe our social world. But at the same time, from the end of the 19th century, of course, various people have started to unpick them, to challenge them, and suggest the ways in which we all encompass potential for hate, love, for anger, for quiet, for reflection, for its absolute absence of reflection. And the third thing that I wanted to say is that in Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson also seems to me to be going some way to explore the ways in which we can think about discovering the causes of mental illness. Robert quoted a short quotation from Jekyll and Hyde in which he said that there was a need in the character to hold his head high, and that burden of measuring up to patriarchal expectations seems to me to be, at least this is the impression from Claire Harmon, a burden which sat very heavily on Stevenson's own shoulders. So I think what we also have to think about is the way in which various forms of social order and social life actually create those kinds of internalized psychological and emotional burdens, material that we very often find is too much for us to deal with. We have to take these things on. These are the, as it were, the agendas which are handed to us, but actually living those out, doing something with them, becomes hugely,
what I wanted to say. But what I'm actually hoping to do is to try and suggest a connection between two, to me, rather key lines within the book. How many people, by the way, have read the book in this audience? That's a lot. That's one. Quite a lot of you. Quite a lot haven't, but okay. Well, the two lines are one from Utterson, the lawyer, goes for a walk on Sundays with his best friend, Enfield. They're characterised, I think this is right, Robert, by their wish not to really talk about anything too deeply. It's a nice walk that they have, and they don't really want to get too deep into any question that arises. But Enfield, very nervously, as it were, does feel he must describe something to Utterson. And that is that he's seen this man, known very quickly as Hyde, suddenly encounter in his walk a young child running in the opposite direction, and Hyde walks straight across his child, trampling the child underfoot, and that's the first most terrible incident within the novel. However, in talking about it, Enfield says to Utterson, it's nothing to hear, hellish to see. And I want to look at the equation or the disconnection between hearing and seeing within we call it a novel, a novella, a small, whatever we call it, short story, whatever it is. I want to look at what is hearing and what is seeing, because I think those two are held very explicitly in tension, T-E-N-S-I-O, they're in tension with each other by Stevenson, because I see this as a novel in which there are a lot of things held in tension in that way, that he's actually talking about, if you like, evidence that will come from hearing as opposed to evidence which will come from seeing, and they're two rather different modalities. And I was thinking about this because I think there are modalities in history, in our own thinking, both today and way back as well. For example, Freud, I'm here as a psychoanalyst to talk to you in a sense. Freud thought it was very important when Moses were able to be icons of God, that actually if you had to think God without seeing a visual representation, you had moved on intellectually. It was a mental construction rather than a visual construction. So seeing is more primitive. Dreams use a modality that is more primitive as a dominant one. We do hear things in dreams rather occasionally. We mostly see things in dreams. And this was a dream that elicited this story. And Stevenson writes very interestingly about the amorality of what he calls his brownies in the dream, the people who are the helpers, who are not moral, ethical people. He, the conscious writer, is the ethical person, unfortunately, he says. But the dreamers, so to speak, his brownies, who see, are not they're creative, like good sort of Hydes in a sense. They're very creative, but they're not very responsible, ethical people. Okay, so it's hellish to see, but it's nothing to hear. And I think that becomes, if you like, a move from seeing as evidence, and I'm not a lawyer at all, so I'm asking the lawyers, evidence as seeing something as evidence, to evidence as testimony when you hear something, and there's that sort of tension held for me within the novel. A more recent example than Moses in the Bible, as it were, perhaps give you a quality of what I'm talking about. I was in a small French village, which Nicky knows, the other week, and talking to a friend in the village who said to me, we were talking about the release of prisoners who've not been found anything wrong and been being charged, they've been completely innocent in Guantanamo, and they releasing them. And she said, yes, but when you see them in cages, you do see that they really are evil. And I sort of took a step backwards and thought, wait a minute, I thought it was the cages that were evil. But actually, the visual representation of a person in a cage, to this person, made those people look evil. So I think it's something we have to still very much bear in mind, because I think, as Nicky was implying, we still have this attribution of character, which is what happens under terrorism. We attribute in a way by character, and but we also have the other, which is listening to testimony. And they're two time scales in a way. They're the primitive and the more sophisticated, but they coexist. They don't move, unfortunately, from one to the other in a neat transition to the more ethical one of hearing and seeing. So I wanted to, if you remember, those of you who have read the novel, it's seeing. It's and you point this out in your introduction, Robert, that it's a maid, Sitless, and God knows why this maid is alone in this beautiful huge house, but she is at a top window, and she sees the murder that Hyde then commits later to link that nothing to hear, hellish to see, to another quotation, which is from, so to speak, Jekyll Hyde. I struck, and this is the murder, I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. Now, if I say I think Hyde is Jekyll's child, or the child within Jekyll, I don't mean that in terms of that we see a nice child wandering around the novel. We obviously don't. And the wonderful, which I would agree with Nikki, the wonderful writerly quality of this, the wonderful construction of it, I'll come to your points about the slippages and the mistakes within it. You're the expert on that. But come to that in a minute. But I think if we look analytically, so to speak, at the writing component, I think there's a very interesting feature of the story, which is that though everybody experiences Hyde, both to visually see him, to come near him is to come near evil, and to be horrified, and to be as frightened and upset as he is, that's not so for Jekyll, who is after all Hyde. Throughout, he is actually always, as it were, not only tolerant, but rather excited by Hyde, likes him, makes a will in his favour, so that if Hyde lives longer than the Jekyll part of the person who's gone, so to speak, he will enjoy all the Jekyll benefits of an eminent career and well-paid career, the money that comes from the family, etc., will all go to Hyde, because Jekyll is actually very favourable towards him and says some very strong things in that direction. He says, well, actually, I can't, I can see that everybody hates him. As soon as they go anywhere near him, they're revolted. But I, Jekyll, have never been like that. I've always actually got time and interest in the energy, the excitement, the sort of creative personality in one sense of this very destructive person. Now, again, Robert in his introduction points out that at the time, the whole notion that ontology repeats phylogeny was very, very dominant. So that what we're doing in our individual histories is what we do in our collective, in the repetition of our collective history. It was one that was very familiar and very important to Freud as well. And at that point, again, you say this, Robert, the primitive was not only the savage, the degenerate, the criminal, but also the child. And they were, as it were, equated. Those groups, and others probably too, were the same. And insofar as I'm looking at it as a psychoanalyst, it's that child of that group of primitives that I think we also have in Hyde. And it's, to go to Mary's sort of thesis, it's the child in Robert Stevenson that he knows about that has led him to be able to create this character. He, after all, is not a degenerate. He is not a criminal. He is not a savage. But he has indeed been a child. The author has been a child, as we all have. And as was to be indeed the basis of psychoanalysis, he realizes that the child is, if you like, evil in some senses. Now, because we turn from an asocial being up to the age of 2, 3, 4, 5 to a social being afterwards, we have this question, how do we do that? Now, if you think about that first instance of Hyde trampling on that child, now those of you who've got children, if you've had about a 2.5-year-old who's had a new baby, brother or sister, it is not at all unusual to see that toddler trample over that baby brother or sister. That is perfectly, so to speak, acceptable. Your parents will come in, hopefully, and say no and stop it, taking it away. Because I'm interested in siblings, I've been observing actually twins since before they were born, till they're now 6 years old, and I've watched them move from exactly that sort of asocial trampling over babies and stealing and fighting each other for toys and being, I was forgotten, I have a child, but she's very grown up. I'd forgotten quite how violent children are with each other up to a certain point. And I did actually bring you a short quotation from a child analyst who added this very much to. Now, you can say that this is a child she's seeing in treatment, is Melanie Klein, but Melanie Klein's point, as all psychoanalysts' point, is exactly, I think Stevenson's point, is that we are two people in one. We are that asocial child right through our lives, and given something traumatic that happens to us, we can reverse to that very, very easily. And I'm very interested in the role of male hysteria in this novel, because that's an example of when we revert to this sort of primitive child in ourselves. This is Gunther, a child that Melanie Klein describes. As I say, she says very clearly, as all animals would, normal people are like this too. But Gunther, age 6, had a sexual life almost entirely lacking in positive elements. In his fantasy, the various sexual procedures he undertook were nothing but a series of cruel and subtle tortures designed in the end to put his object to death. That's a 6-year-old. Okay, that's the child. That's the child in Hyde. It's not the picture that we get. We get the picture of pure evil because that's the technique of the novel. That's the whole point. They are one character. Jekyll is Hyde. And where you see mistakes, and you did write a past, so did Dickens, and these people are very expert. I'm not sure how much those mistakes were from. Anyway, for me, those mistakes were, as it were, the clues to us knowing that Jekyll is Hyde much earlier than the confession to Lanyon. And if we, as you did with Gabriel, I was looking at names. Lanyon, the lawyer who is hasty, is his first name. He sure is hasty. Utterson, he does indeed utter on. Mm-hmm. And then I wondered about Jekyll, who, of course, it's a very common name, Gertrude Jekyll, the gardener, etc., etc. But Stevenson was very, very into French literature for this, for the material behind this novel. Hyde, H-Y-D-E, there's a pun within the novel, which he's Hyde, H-I-D-E, hide and seek is a pun within the novel. He's hidden within the Jekyll character. Jekyll, if you change the Y to an I, is je kill, I kill. So Jekyll is the person who kills. He is Hyde. Now I think that what you are calling mistakes may indeed, you're right, you know it, I don't. They may indeed be mistakes, but one that you mentioned before the talk, in what I read of your writing, you say how we can't understand why Utterson so wanted to see Hyde, because then he would know what had gone wrong for Jekyll. It was an earlier draft in which the idea was that Hyde was an illegitimate child who was blackmailing Jekyll. And he changed this because he didn't want that in the final version, but he left in Utterson's compulsion to see. Now I would relate that to primitive need to see character, that he intentionally left in as in a sense of clue that he did need to see this person to get an image of what was going on, and that links back to this primitive way in which people need to see to understand. I've got much more that I could go on with that, but I think we should stop and open it to the audience. But I want to link, therefore, the primitive child in the construction, not in the actual effect of the writerliness of the novel. I mean, Hyde comes over as pure evil, and what Stevenson has effectively achieved, I think, is, after he knew the story, he knew what he was writing about, whether it was a dream or not, he certainly knew what it's about, and he, in his writings on dreams, says his own role is to know what it's about, and he knew that they were one character. And that's what's interesting. What the drug, which we initially told is a neutral drug, we then told actually it was probably an impure version of a neutral drug anyway, and this neutral drug is one person, a split, that one person is pure evil. The other is not pure good, the other is rather tolerant of that pure evil. But of course, because nowhere is there ever pure evil, but there is in Hyde pure evil, then of course people are revolted by that. So that when we see a child, and I think this still pertains today, I was thinking of those two boys that recently have been accused of torturing almost to death their two children in North England. I think we have a different reaction to child criminality than we have in the public mind. Child criminality does shock us in a way that the adult doesn't quite, and I think it's an interesting question here, because if we see the child within Stevenson informing the creation of the degenerate, the savage, the pure evil within Hyde, I think we ask some different questions of the novel, and I think we see the incredible construction of how we do know through hints that it's one person, that we don't know it. We're disturbed by it. It's part of our disturbance in the novel. In fact, he makes it two until we learn at the end it is one.
I wonder, obviously we have a great deal to reflect on already. Before we turn it over to the audience, maybe I could abuse my role as chair by just raising a couple of questions for the panel. One actually relates to what Juliet's been saying about the difference between hearing and seeing. And I guess from a sort of legal point of view, hearing, of course, is very problematic in the late 19th century, because this
sorry, I haven't actually read it, but it strikes me that there's a geographical bipolarity in Victorian and earlier novels of the 19th century, where the aristocratic male or the genteel male, for huge stretches of time, leaves the country house to do business in town, where you know that he is getting up to all sorts of things. It's sometimes quite explicit, like in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, or in even Mr. Rochester, being catered to in every kind of sexual perversion by hordes of lower-class prostitutes. So you have that geographical bipolarity where people, males, are living two lives, and this becomes developed in the later 19th century.
Well, there's, you mentioned that, there's the Sherlock Holmes story of the man with the twisted lip, which was 1891, which was only sort of 4 years after Jekyll and Hyde. And I think it's a kind of answer to that, because you have this chap who does come in from the suburbs, and he actually, he's a beggar. He lives by begging because he makes so much money, by making himself hideous, by making himself this sort of Hyde figure, where he twists his lip up and puts this ginger syrup on his head, and he's described as the most revolting person because he's so ugly. He elicits sympathy and money, and he comes in each day, tells his wife who he loves and he's supporting, that he's doing something in the city, and that's exactly that. And it's really interesting. I think it's an answer to Jekyll and Hyde, because it is solved by rational means. The very thing that Utterson wasn't able to do, Holmes is able to do. He just sits up all night smoking his pipe and thinking, and then he says, I've got it. I was blind as a mole not to see. So this is the whole kind of idea of visibility. They go back into town from the suburb. He brings a bath sponge out of the, I don't know if you know the story, but so if you don't know, this won't make any sense to you. But he manages to kind of unhide Hyde and may turn him into the Jekyll by simply a bit of, spit wash. Here you go. Wipe that off, and then suddenly it dissolves in front of, and Watson said, I've never seen anything like that before. His face peeled off like a bark, and there he was. It's very similar to the transformation of Hyde into Jekyll, but it's done entirely by reasonable means of Holmes being Holmes and showing off and just simply thinking. And because it is within this rational space, this man who's been living a double life, because it's within this rational space, it's doable within a rational framework. And so it kind of fits in that. It wasn't really depravity. He hung out in an opium den, but he was merely begging.
Any other, we can collect the thought.
Thank you. I'm interested in Hyde as the slime of the pit appearing on Earth. I'm a teacher, and I've just been teaching Oliver Twist recently. Fagin also emerges out of the primeval slime, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on any relationship there might be between the two.
Any other?
I'm interested in something that I think runs through all four of your comments on Jekyll and Hyde, which is in a sense the development of the uncanny. The same period that Stevenson was writing Jekyll and Hyde, the other genres of the uncanny were starting to come into the public or the written consciousness, the ghost story, what we might consider proto-science fiction. And obviously, as ever, the myth or the fantasy of the changeling. And I'm wondering now whether you could all comment on how these themes might have, through Jekyll and Hyde, might be recognizable today in questions, for example, cyborgs, the divisible self, something which can be displaced out of the human through science, but also not quite escape, I suppose, what you called the roots of humanity at the same time. So this is more of a literary theory question, but I wondered if you could comment on it.
Gentlemen, please.
I haven't read the book, but seen parts of the movie. not the whole movie even, but I think I get the story a little bit. Just wanted to ask you, the way it's been presented, the theme of the novel is that evil and good lies within the person. But there's no discussion about the social context or circumstances in which evil is more likely or good is more likely to happen. So I just wanted you to reflect on that.
I think we have two more. The lady.
My question is related to the one just asked. I'd like to know something about the notion of evil in law today, in psychoanalysis today. The French always talk about a mauvais caractère. Judges say that you are pure evil, but is anyone pure evil, or is it only that there are evil deeds? I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
Hi, thank you. I was actually quite interested less in the binary, I guess, of good and evil, but more in the role of imagination and deviance, and the idea that the criminal law actually is sort of a social control mechanism linked to, someone said something about patriarchy, so thinking about, actually, is this more about imagination and dreaming of deviance rather than good versus evil?
Thank you very much. I think we will now go back to our
Do you want to do reverse order this time?
yeah, absolutely.
Gosh. Okay, I'll start with reverse order then. The last question about good and evil. I think in psychoanalysis, it wasn't a concept used very much in the early days of psychoanalysis, because then at that point the real, if you like, discovery was this sense that there is a complete continuum between what in this novel we call moral insanity or total neurosis or psychosis, the hysteria or the psychotic deluded person, and the normal person. And there was a continuum along that line, so that you wouldn't have the concept of pure evil and pure good, that everybody was, as Stevenson says in this work, a mixture of both. I think more because exactly people do talk quite a lot about the evil again today. I mean, it was talked about, of course, in the late 19th century. I don't mean it wasn't, but the whole thrust of psychoanalysis was against that sort of division of good and evil. That it was seen as not what was being observed in terms of understanding the unconscious versus the conscious. Now there are more discussions of evil. I think what one, as a sort of working definition, one might say that something seems evil when somebody has absolutely no regard for the other, for the object, for the other person at all. It's completely it's the extreme of a psychopathic personality. That extreme could be near to evil because there's no concern whatsoever, and that would be understood in terms of what has happened in that transition from what I was describing as the still largely asocial child who can be indeed very violent. Luckily they're only a child, so they're not Hyde. The toddler who can hurt the baby is only a child and isn't likely, though things do happen, quite serious things do happen, but isn't likely to kill it because of their own weakness and because parents are there. But if that part becomes totally asocial forever, so to speak, and has no concern for the other, then it could develop into something that seems like evil. I think it would really be seen as something being evil in a context, and here again the social context would come into it, and it wouldn't be for the whole personality for all time. But usually you think of, this goes back to Nikki's points about her interest in responsibility. I think that even in the most deluded state, there is also, which would be a very unconscious state, there's also a conscious part of the self that can watch it, can look at the unconscious part and what that's doing, and that part has responsibility for the other part too, so to speak. So, and the whole thrust of analytical therapy is, or psychoanalysis rather than just therapy, is to actually bring as much as possible into consciousness, so then you can decide what to do with it, so to speak. It stays unconscious and you don't know about it. But that's where the evil would lie, in that lack of any meaning of another person whatsoever, that they mean nothing. So that's, I mean, there are lots of other questions. I was very interested about the countryside city. That seems a very interesting division that I think is still with us in some ways. It's not in social practice so much with us, but we do see, I think we still do have that sort of imago in our minds of a division between relatively innocent countryside versus the evils of town. And there's a sort of reality base, which is it's just much more stressful to live in fantastically, in it's a slum planet, as it's been called, that we're moving towards as the world divides more into the extremely rich and the extremely poor, as the world is going increasingly that way. I mean, our own country being a prime example of it. People who are living in planet slum are living with such conditions of social stress, as is to go to the social question, that it's actually much harder to have concern for other people. Back to my definition of where we would look for somebody who would be likely to express in evil parts of their personality.
Okay, I thought that one of the themes that perhaps pulled some of the questions together was the idea about revelation, because one of the things that strikes me about the period in which Stevenson writes Jekyll and Hyde is it's also the period in which, and this is a material which appears in many, many textbooks on criminology, people thought you could measure criminals' foreheads to see, who was evil. The criminally degenerate person was actually physically identifiable. Now that kind of extreme literalness, which is often associated in literature with an unkempt appearance, with what Fagin looks like, with Fagin's sort of particular racial characteristics, always is very often presented in the 20th century as something that we educate ourselves out of, as if, and those very photographs, those late 19th century photographs of criminal types with narrow foreheads, is actually presented as, well, look how far we've come. We now know this is nonsense. But where we present ourselves as having got to is a position, of course, in which we look for other signs of evil, and in which we hold very much more often the social world as the site of the generation of evil, rather than something that lies within the individual. I mean, I think the disjunction between the city and the country is a very important one, which dominates English culture from the 18th century. I mean, the city is always seen as a place of sin, fear, murder, disruption, criminality, vice, various kinds of things happen in the city. Edgar Allan Poe's novels in the 1840s happen in the Rue Morgue. They don't happen in the middle of the countryside. And it's that kind of sense of the closeness of human beings to each other, which somehow creates a social stress, which evolves into terrible things happening. So what I find interesting is the sense in which, as I say, we think we've moved away from these literal representations and revelations of evil, but I do wonder actually how far we've got, because it does seem to me that very often we look for other forms of identifiable evil in character, in personality, and indeed still in appearance. So what I would question is this sense of, which, as I say, we sometimes present about ourselves, that we've somehow come a long way from the kind of material that was around at the time that Stevenson was writing Jekyll and Hyde. And I think it's also important, just as one final biographical point about Stevenson, to say that where he had to go at the end of his life was to remove himself from the United Kingdom. He spent the rest of his life in the South Pacific. He moved to a culture where obviously he felt he could find some kind of relief from those social pressures which he found too disruptive and too much to bear in the world from which he came.
interestingly, he wrote it in Bournemouth.
Yes.
I think some of the kind of vagueness about geography derives from that. But I think he had some maps, but it was kind of, I think just leaves things quite vague. And I'm going to pick up on the city point as well, because that's, I think, one of the most fascinating things about 19th century literature of the Gothic, really. That the Gothic happened in the city in the 19th century. When the sort of Gothic came about, it was the remote, it was the countryside, it was over there, it was in the south of Europe, in castles and forests. It was very much the sort of rural. But in the 19th century, and with Oliver Twist, a very important book, the Gothic is placed within the heart of the city. But a demarcated area, in fact not so very far from here, down towards Farringdon, Smithfield, that area is where the slum is. And that's a demarcated area, it's a labyrinth, but it's cheek by jowl with this district, with the Mighall representing civilization, etc. And that's a demarcation that's very, very important in the 19th century. What's really, really interesting about the difference between Oliver Twist and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's completely disrupted. It's disrupted in two ways. Jekyll has his mansion, but you only have to go around the back to find this shabby, nasty little door that represents Hyde. And I think that's a kind of allegory of the Jekyll within the Hyde, that there is this kind of actually really existing within it, the same strange little opening. I mean, it's the puzzle, it's the first puzzle of the book. What's this strange little house? That's what the door, yes, but they are trying to work out how it fits. So it's been built on, and you can't really work out how it kind of fits. And they don't twig at that point. But that's actually part of Jekyll's mansion, which I think is kind of, if you want an allegory of what it's about, it's kind of there and then. But also it's this idea that, so you've got this kind of allegory, this geographical, topographical allegory, but also the idea that you can't keep those divisions, because all you need to do is just go around the corner and the fog creeps in, and the fog stops you being able to see the difference between these things as well. So it really is about erasing those differences. Although I do think the most the Dickens novel that's closest to it's actually Bleak House. You've got the fog, you've got the legal issues, you've got the identifying someone through their handwriting. And interestingly, in Bleak House you've got two people with the same name, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, warring. In Jekyll and Hyde you've got one person with two different names warring within himself. So I think it's a kind of nod to Bleak House, actually. When there's that wonderful passage where they go into Soho and the fog descends, and that's very much that is a nod to Dickens, and it's a sort of nod to when they go into Tom All Alone's, and it's all kind of slimy, etc. But there's a lot of slime in those novels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for all those wonderful questions. I'm just going to again try and pick out a couple of themes. I'm also interested in the city theme, and I think you see that separation in Jekyll and Hyde, as Robert was saying, but what I thought you were also going to say, because I think it's what you argue in your book, is that there also isn't. I mean, the thing is that comforting idea that there is actually a physical separation isn't there in Jekyll and Hyde, because it's disrupted by the unity of Jekyll and Hyde. But it's a long time since I read Oliver Twist, and I'd forgotten about Fagin. And I do think Dickens is very interesting, because although I agree with you that Bleak House is the obviously Gothic Dickens definitely drops elements of the Gothic into many of his novels.
About 80%.
Absolutely, exactly. And so I think that's. But it's all over the Gothic tradition. And I'm thinking of not just Hogg, which I'm not sure does quite count as Gothic, but is full of slime of the pit kind of language, the Confessions of a Justified Sinner, but also a marvellously exotic book called Zafloya by Charlotte Dacre, I think, which has again got somebody who is sort of, on the one hand, a mad and charismatic, to be ahistorical Rasputin kind of figure, and on another level is definitely from way down there. The city as the fount of evil, though, is really not confined to the Gothic, it seems to me. I mean, for example, in the emerging realist novel of the, and of course there's a lot of debate about the the boundaries between these different, so-called different genres of literature, but I think London features as an object of enormous suspicion in the early realist novels. I'm thinking, for example, of one of my favourite Smollett's, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, which involves a rather sort of intemperate gentleman going on travels round the country, and when he finally gets to London, he basically compares everywhere, and it's mostly cities that he visits. He compares everywhere unfavourably with his nice, comfortable home, but London does scores worst. Finally, this question about evil in law and in literature. The debate about whether evil is socially produced or inheres in people goes right back to the beginnings of the novel, it seems to me. It's absolutely not confined to the Gothic. What's interesting to me, though, is that there is a further division in the literature and indeed the law, which does sign up, in a sense, to a theory of individual evil nature, that there are what we might call sort of natural and supernatural accounts of that. And it's the way the natural and the supernatural, either in the ghost story type sense or in the theological sense, sit together in Jekyll and Hyde, that I think is really quite interesting, because I think in many earlier books you get introduced, basically the author comes down on one side or the other. Clearly, as far as criminal law is concerned, there was a move in the 19th century towards a greater acknowledgement of either the natural, i.e. scientific argument about sort of individual badness, or the socially constructed one. And I think that duality has remained in law. And if you ask me about criminal law today, well, on the one hand, evil in criminal law is whatever the legislature says it is. It might be, having a dangerous dog, or going to a rave, which is marvellously defined in the statute, or it might be committing murder or rape. It's all very sort of just what the law provides. But of course, when you get to the actual practice, the enactment of the judgment in judicial language, for example, particularly at the sentencing stage, those images of evil come right back in, and of course that's what we read in our tabloid newspapers. Indeed, not only our tabloids.
Any further reflections, thoughts?
I think this thing about pure evil, I think what's really interesting about the text is that Hyde isn't pure evil. He starts to become a lot like Jekyll. I think or even throughout, what's really interesting is this kind of, I think it goes back to this kind of father and son type analogy. It struck me that when Hyde is acting like Jekyll, he's like a teenager that occasionally has to be nice to dad so he can borrow the car.
He actually talks about the indifference,
absolutely,
the son's indifference to a father at one point.
That's key, because the whole thing, if you think about it, the first thing you hear about is the story about Hyde trampling the child and then rounding on him, and he said, first thing we hear Hyde say is, no gentleman but cares about his reputation. He ain't a gentleman. He's this slum-dwelling, degenerate, pure evil who doesn't care. He cares. He's as bourgeois as Jekyll. He gets out a cheque and he worries about his reputation. And the whole point of Hyde is that Jekyll could get away with being purely on that side, so he can have his alibi to all his dirty tricks for him, and so he can get away with it. He doesn't get away with it because Hyde has a good deal of the Jekyll in him. And it's really interesting to see, this is what I mean about the slippages. And when Jekyll talks about himself and starts becoming Hyde-like in his description, because he is mixed, it's the mixed part of Hyde as well that makes for a really interesting play, I think, where we can kind of see him acting quite bourgeois, acting quite responsibly. And I think there's a few kind of puzzles on why he does something or why he says something. It sounds a lot like Jekyll. So he is literally a chip off the old block.
Well, he is the old block.
I guess we should all now go off and reckon with the fact that our inner child is not cute. As we do so, perhaps we could extend thanks to our speakers.